Hi everyone and welcome or welcome back. In today's session we're going to talk about frames. Frames are essentially containers. They contain anything inside of your design file that you need to be contained, and that could be from the smallest thing like a card or a button to the largest thing, which is the screen itself that you're designing or the poster that you're designing itself. You can insert a frame by using the frame tool in the tab bar, which is just up here. You can also just click on F on your keyboard to get one. But once I click on the frame tool, you'll see our design panel will transform to all of the preset frame sizes that you have in Figma. So you've got phones, tablets, desktop, presentation, paper, social media. You've got loads and loads of different presets here. Now if I add one of these, let me show you. For example, if I add an iPhone 14, it will just add that at the edge of our design, so kind of the next available space for it to go. And I'm going to add a frame, so I'm going to tap on F and I'm just going to create one here. Now the cool thing about frames is, yes, they're a container, but they can also have properties of their own. So just like we saw with shapes before, or with text, where it can have a fill color, can have an effect, can have a stroke, the same thing is true for frames. So I can give a frame a fill color. Let's make it black. I can give it rounded corners. I can add a stroke onto it. I can add an effect. So you see, and that's just the frame itself. There's nothing in it yet. And it's that container that can have stuff in it, which is really what makes frames unique. One more container that we're really familiar with is groups, right? It's a way of putting a few things together and just saying, you know, these items are now grouped, we can move them around, so they're contained by that group. So we're going to go through the difference between a frame and a group to understand how these two are different from each other. And there's three key differences. One, a frame can have properties a group cannot. So if I look at the three shapes that I have here, I'm just going to select them. So I'm going to select 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to frame these three items together. I'm going to right click and say frame selection. Now you see over here, they're now in a frame. It's called frame 67. If I toggle this, you'll see that they're kind of tabbed in on the layers panel, which means that they're inside of that frame. I'm just going to call this shapes frame. I'm going to select these three. Again, I'm holding down Command like I did in previous videos to do that deep selection. I'm going to select these three shapes, and now I'm going to group selection. So you see that they're a group. Now a group gets the little dotted line around it, and a frame gets that little hashtag symbol. And I'm going to call this shapes group. Now if I select this frame and I move it around, I'm moving all the items together, and here I'm moving all the items together, so container, container. But what will happen if I try and add a fill color onto both? So I'm going to select the frame, and over here you see the fill section is empty, right? Because frame is saying I don't have a fill color. If I click on plus, I'm just going to make this black. The frame itself took on that fill color. Let's see what happens if I try and do the same thing with the group. If I click on the group, you see now it says click plus to replace mixed content. So it's not empty, it's telling me there's some sort of mixed fill going on. And if I add a color, again, I'll make this black. Look what happened. Yeah, it can't take on that fill color because it can't have properties of its own. So it's going to color anything that's inside of it, all of its children, right? Because the group is the parent, the items inside are the children, it's a child-parent relationship. Difference number 2 is the way the child reacts when the parent changes size. So in a frame, if I take that parent, that frame, and I make it bigger, I'm just going to drag to the frame again. It can have properties of its own. It can have a width and height, so it's just going to grow. The children, the shapes inside of it are not affected. If I select the group now and I change size, look what happened. Everything inside of it grew because the group itself has no properties. It can't grow if the children don't grow. I'm going to put a little asterisk over here and say that in the end of the session, we're going to talk about constraints. And constraints are a way of making the children respond when their parent, which is a frame, changes, but we'll get to that later. The third difference, and I think that one that is kind of the most important, is that frames can be empty, groups cannot. Let me show you. If I take this frame over here and I'm going to take the shapes that are inside the frame and just take them outside of the frame. Okay, so remember this is a layers tool. So right now they're tabbed in because they're inside of this. But if I just bring them out, now they're not inside of it anymore. This frame lives on, right? So I'm here, I'm fine. I don't need any children. I don't need anything inside of me to survive. Whereas look what happens when I do the same thing to the group. So I'm gonna expand it, select my shapes and just remove them from the group disappears. right? There's no more group in the layers panel because the only reason for the group's existence is to have the shapes within it. The one thing that frames cannot do is not be a rectangle. This frame, for example, it is a rectangle, right? I can make it 100% rounded corners and give it 1-to-1 kind of width and height, and it's a fake circle, but it's still a rectangle. So a frame can't be a star, it can't be a triangle. It can have a triangle shape inside of it, but it can't be it itself. A frame can sometimes just be empty, and right now we just have this empty frame kind of floating around here, and that can sometimes cause issues in our designs. If we just have something, we're not sure what it is, but it's blocking and it's in the way, it can just be a frame, especially if your designs are later going on to development and they are really looking meticulously at the layers panel to see what's included and they just see an empty frame, they might get confused. So just make sure you're aware of any empty frames floating around in your design. Now, I mentioned over here that a frame can clip its content. What does this mean exactly? If we look at this frame over here, we have a lovely frame that's 323 by 198, and it's got 2 items inside of it. It's got a picture and it's got some text. If I hover over this text box, you see there's more text box down there, and this image, again, I can only see the head. Where's everything else? Now, the reason for this is because this frame is only 198 pixels high. If I look at the text box is 399, for example, and this guy, he's 137, but he's quite far down. So if I make this frame larger, I'll see everything, right? I have this handy little tool over here called Resize to Fit, and what that will do is it will just look at all of the children and kind of hug them. So if I click on that, that will happen. But again, I've lost my nice little padding I had at the top. So the reason I can't see everything that's in this frame is because I've checked a feature called Clip Content, which lives over here in the transform section. If I untick this, I can still see everything else. I can see these, but as you can see, the frame itself still ends here. And this is inside of the frame, but it looks like it's outside of it. So the reason for that is sometimes your frame needs to be a specific size, and the user will be able to see things outside of that frame if they use the scroll feature. But you still want to know what is that original size, right? Let's say it's a screen of a phone or a screen of a desktop or a poster or anything that you want to know what is the actual size. You want to be able to design outside of it, but you want to still have that way of looking at what is the original size. Some people refer to this as kind of a mask, but I think it's different because you can also use normal masking in Figma. Now, constraints can be a very tricky one to understand, so I'd recommend for now, leave your exercise file alone and just come to the video, fully focus in, and just watch me do this for a second. Constraints are basically a way of telling the child how to react when its parent changes size. So we talked about parent-children relationship a bit before. A child is essentially anything that is contained inside of a different object, and the object it's inside of is the parent. So you see I've got 4 frames here, left top, left right, top bottom, center, and scale. And inside of each one of them, I've got a shape, a rectangle, and some text. So we're going to look at the different kinds of constraints and see how they respond when I change the size of these parents. So if I select this shape here, you will see the constraints comes up straight away. Now, again, in Figma, everything is super visual and you could do everything like 4 different ways. So you can see that this one is set to the default constraints, which are left and top. See, the dotted line here is showing me that it's constrained to the left, and the dotted line here shows me it's constrained to the top. I also see it visually here in this box and also in these drop downs, left, top. I'm going to put this one on center, so you can see that it's constrained to the center here, and visually in the center. This one is constrained to left, right, top, and bottom. And again, you can view all that here. And this one is constrained to scale. Now, scale is the only one that doesn't have a visual representation. So that's how you know it's that one. So you don't have any of the blue lines here, and you don't have any blue lines on this little visual. Let's see what this actually means. I'm going to take these frames, select them all. I'm going to bring them a bit closer together and move them up to the top. Now I'm going to just resize the frames themselves. I want you to see straight away, we can tell that these constraints make a big difference, right? You can see that each one of these shapes responded completely differently. So top left basically is saying, I am constraining myself to the left and to the top, and I don't care what happens, I am staying close to them as much as possible. My video might be flipped. This is my left hand. You might be seeing it as my right. So it's going to be constrained to the top and to the left. And it's going to stay there. So it doesn't really matter what happens to the parent. You see, that shape just stays there. And if I grow from that side, again, it's just going to stick to that. This shape, on the other hand, that's constrained to the center and to the center is saying I'm going to stay centered inside of my parent no matter what happens. If I grow over here, I grow over there, it doesn't really matter. It's going to stay centered. This one, on the other hand, is saying I'm going to change my size. So I keep the exact same distance from the left and the right and the top and the bottom of my parent. So it started off with this distance, which is a certain amount of pixels. Let's say it's 10 pixels. And it's saying I'm going to keep that distance as 10 pixels no matter what happens. So if the parent changes, you can notice that that just stays exactly the same. Scale, on the other hand, is saying I'm going to scale accordingly. If my parent grows by 1.97, I'm going to grow by 1.97. Okay, so that's what scale does. Let's dive into a little exercise and build a few elements together that will help us see how constraints can help us and protect us for when the design changes in the future. So I'm just in the file that I was. There's no set exercise section for this. We're just going to use a blank canvas and work together. Now, the first thing I want to do is sort of create a dynamic button together and show you how we can protect ourselves when we don't know exactly how the button should look. I'm going to click on T, and if you watched my text video, if you did not, I will link it somewhere around here. And as you know, we're not going to drag to create a text box because that creates a fixed sized text box, which we don't want. We're just going to tap in and start writing. So let's say label, okay? Now I'm going to set it to be left aligned and top aligned for now. Now this label is going to be my button. Now when creating a button in different design tools, you may have created a rectangle, given it a fill color, another one on top with just the stroke, another one with just the drop shadow, and then the text, and group them all together. But remember, within Figma, we don't need to do that. We can just use a frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click my label and say frame selection. That will create a frame that is exactly the size of my little text box there, called frame 67 for now, but that's not indicative. So I'm going to Command R in order to rename and just say my button. First thing I want to do is give that button some fill color so I can see the background that I'm working with. Now, essentially this is a button, right? I'm done. But this is, between us, pretty ugly. So I want to style it up a bit. Let's give it rounded corners. Let's give it, I don't know, 8 pixels rounded corners. It looks a bit pill shaped now, so I need to make it a bit bigger, right? What you would instinctively do is kind of grab it by the corner, maybe hold down shift, maybe not, and just drag to get the size you want. But there is one thing that we know about buttons that is 100% sure. We don't know if they'll have rounded corners, we don't know what color they'll be, we don't know what size they'll be or what shape they'll be exactly, but we know that the label will forever be in the center of the button, right? So yeah, I can change the shape and then grab the label and then using my align tools, because it's the child, align it to the center and to the center of the parent and use Option V and H to align it. And then, no, I want it to be a bit, maybe like this. And then grab it again and do that again. Or I can use constraints to make sure that that label is forever centered no matter what I do. So I'm gonna just Command Z to bring it back. And before I do anything, I'm gonna get my text box and align it to the center and the center. Now, when I select my frame and move it around and try and figure out what shape I want this button to be in, the label will forever stay centered. That just automatically makes your design process like 10 times faster because you don't have to keep realigning it. It just stays there. It just knows where it needs to be. So now we've kind of protected ourselves. I'm gonna keep my button about this shape. I want it to be, let's say, 150 by 50. I would recommend always using round numbers and numbers that kind of have a ratio between them. You know, 150 is 3 times 50, so that gives us a nice little rectangle, and it's a good ratio to work with. Now I've got my button, I'm ready to go. Let's do one more thing. I want to create 3 of these buttons because I want to like pretend I'm making a menu of buttons. I'm going to hold down Option and drag while holding down Shift as well to give me a straight line. And let's say this one says home. This one will say about me, and this one will say contact us. We can see that we need to do some work in order to get these sorted, right? I need to click on about me, and then I need to use my align tools to center it within its parent, Option V, Option H. I need to do that again for this one, maybe even this one again. Right, so I've just added more work onto myself. So the constraints helped me out when I was just, pulling and pushing. But what could I have done to make this super dynamic? How can I make it so the text grows from the center as well? Right, so this one is already centered using constraints, so the text box itself is centered, but if I change the text, it still goes out of whack. So what I can do is I can say text align center. And that will mean that because the text is now growing from the center, even if it's one syllable, lots of syllables, or 4 syllables, it still stays centered, right? So I've just massively protected myself from anything, right? Anything that comes my way, I know that that home and that about me and that number 1 and that label is staying centered no matter how many characters are in it and no matter how much its parent grows. Another really good example of how constraints help us out is tab bars and footers. So let's create one quickly together. I'm going to drop in a frame that's a phone size. I'm just going to use iPhone 14 for now, and I'm calling it my phone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some text, add an icon, frame them, and create a little navigation bar. I'm going to tap on T, I'm going to click in and say my app. Now this is still center aligned from before. I'm going to make it left aligned. Then I want a little icon here on the side. So I'm going to introduce you to another plugin that I love, which is called Iconify. Plugins come from the resources tool between T and hand. So I'm just going to click on that and search for Iconify. Now, Iconify is a massive resource of loads and loads and loads of icons, and it's just really great. So I'm going to select home, search over here. Let's say this one is good for me. I'm going to import it. It's going to come down here, and it's a vector inside of a frame, which is good for me for now. It's going to change this and call this icon. So I've got these 2 little objects that are going to go in my navigation bar. I'm going to select both of them and then frame selection. I know that a nav bar should be about 80 pixels high, so I'm going to say 80 pixels high. And then let's give it a fill color just so we can see the background. So I'm going to add a fill color, a nice yellowy green color. I know that the My App and the little home icon need to be centered, right? They need to be vertically centered in this parent. So I'm going to vertically center them using my align tools. That's great. And I don't know what the width of it is. It's going to be the width of the phone, but I don't know, right? So I do know that I want it to have a bit of padding between the edges where it doesn't touch the edge. Let's say I want to give it about 15 pixels of padding on the side. So right now, I'm going to make sure that it's aligned fully to the left of its parent. So you see it's on 0, and then I'm going to add 15. So say plus 15, and that's going to move 15 pixels in. The home icon, I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. So I'm going to say align to the right, and then on the X, I'm going to say minus 15. So that's going to move 15 pixels in. Now you'll notice there's a bit more padding here because there's padding from the frame that the vector is inside, so between the vector and the frame that it's in, but I'm fine with that, so I'm going to keep that for now. Now, I'm going to drop this navigation bar into my phone in a second, but again, let's use constraints to really protect ourselves before we do that. So first of all, I want my app is going to forever stay to the left, and I think I want to constrain it to the top, so this seems fine. This one, however, needs to respond and stay close to the right? I needed to keep that 15 pixels from the right rather than keep the 15 pixels from the left. So I'm just going to tell it to be constrained to the right and top. And I'm going to drop this into my frame. Just going to hover over here, and then you see that the frame gets highlighted. I'm going to align it to the left and to the top. So I make sure it's right at that corner. Then I'm going to just grab it from the side and make it as wide as it can be. That is great, right? I just protected myself so when the navigation changes and I make it a bit longer, the icons move and the text moves accordingly. But let's take this one step further. I'm now designing for this iPhone, but what happens if I suddenly decide I want to do this iPhone instead? Or if I'm actually going with a Surface Pro? That's a lot bigger, right? So now I have to go back in and change it. Let's protect ourselves again. So I'm just going to Command Z to bring it back to the full size from before. Let's have a look here. Which one of these will be the one that we need? I'm gonna give you a second to think. Did you say left, right? That is very correct. I want the navigation bar to keep the same distance it has from left and right always, no matter what the parent does. The distance it has between left and right now is 0 pixels, and that's how I want it to stay. So I'm going to constrain it to top is fine for me because it needs to stick to the top, right? And left and right. And now when I change this, if I take this frame and I make it Surface Pro again, look at that. My nav bar grew automatically. And that will happen if I move it manually, or if I select a different frame size with an iPad mini. I can also change the orientation, so I can say landscape, portrait. To summarize, we spoke about frames today, how you can give them properties, how they're different from groups, how you can nest them inside of each other, how you can use them with constraints to create super dynamic components in your design system, and how you can clip their content to do some masking or just hide bits of text that your user won't potentially see. I hope you followed along and learned a lot. See you next time.